conference itself. Before we get started too, I just want to give a massive thank you to everybody that helped organize the call. Amy on the Ripple marketing team, Honcho too, did a great job from Ripple putting together questions, aggregating things like that, getting a little agenda and topic to here. And then thank you very much to Abner Tobias Goose as well for setting up the stage and the question and answer. With regard to questions and answers, we are going to be posting this call onto the XRP Ledger Foundation YouTube channel. It usually takes us a few days after the call to post the video. But with that, I ask that everybody please submit your questions in written format for the call. So we want to include questions from community members. But it's a lot easier for everybody if you all can submit your questions. Call question channel up under the community call heading here in the Discord. The reason for that is just that the XRP Ledger Foundation has a lot of strict policies around our social media accounts. We want to be very careful that we're giving everybody accurate information. And if we start taking live questions and having more of a live conversation, we start getting into territory where we might be violating our own social media policy for us to post the recordings and makes the entire call less accessible. So thank you again. I really appreciate you all posting your questions in written format in the call channel there. All right, I'm gonna head off now and turn things over. Daniel's gonna be hosting the call, and we've got Nik Bougalis from Ripple as a guest today, and Ripple in New Zealand, who's one of our UNL Validator operating infrastructure on the XRP Ledger for some years now, talking about amendment, how the network develops. So I'll turn it over to them. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for kicking us off and thanks for the introduction. And I say, let's not waste any more time and just jump right into this. I got a couple of questions and an overview of the agenda. It's not my original setup, so I have to jump back and forth between the documents. So let's get started. Just let me add one more thing. I think the topics for tonight are pretty interesting because a lot of people are not entirely understanding, or it's not entirely clear for them how the amendment and the voting stuff works. So getting into detail for the broader community will be very beneficial for all of us. So that being said, the first question we have, which is for Chris, is why does the XRP ledger have amendments?
Good morning from New Zealand, and good afternoon or good evening wherever you are. So thanks for the invite into this, and amendments has been a passion of mine to learn about and discuss, because obviously when I became a validator and prior to being invited onto anybody's lists, I had a lot of curiosity, and the instructions that I was reading and the information I was reading wasn't 100% clear. There was a lot of contradiction, and so there was a lot of confusion. And so as a result of that, and a lot of you would have seen over recent times, I've been discussing a lot about the amendment process and put out a thread about it on Twitter. But fundamentally, and Nik will be able to correct me if I'm wrong here, but from my perspective, amendments are primarily a fully functional feature or change that occurs to the XRP ledger to add more functionality to it, or to enable some fixes of less essential things, and most likely along the lines of fixing an amendment that is in the process of being added where a fault has been found during testing. And a recent example of that is the XLS20 amendment that was amended to the ledger, and then some faults were found, and so amendments were made to fix those faults. But fundamentally, it is a feature that has been added to give people the opportunity to add a function or improve on existing functions of the ledger.
So let me, hi, Nik Bougalis here from Ripple. Let me maybe add a little bit more context to the answer. So the XRP ledger is a decentralized system, right? People run their own servers. People, individual servers all process every transaction, right? So when a transaction comes through on the ledger, your server just doesn't accept, oh my God, like the validator said, this is cool, let's accept it. Your server actually runs and executes that transaction based on the rules of the network as it understands them. And so this becomes a challenge if you want to make improvements, right? Say the XLS 20 changes, right, that introduced native NFT support. Servers that don't understand these new changes will not be able to process transactions. And so the network needs a mechanism to perform this sort of coordinated may not be the right word, but atomic activation of certain features, right? To be able to say this feature, is now part of the rules of the network, right? Whereas before it wasn't. And that's the whole point of the amendment mechanism, right? It makes transaction processing changes, right? Whether those are changes to an existing transaction or introduction of new types of transactions. It puts a gate that the network as a whole can look at and say, is this feature enabled? Or is this particular change enabled, or is it not, right? And the idea is that then people can vote and decide whether these features can be, should be activated or not. And the network makes this decision collaboratively.
Yeah, I think these answers have been quite good and should make it very clear on what an amendment is. So a lot of people would now ask, okay, so how does the voting process look like? And it's not on the list of questions, or it's a question for later, but why does it take so long till a voting is happening? And when it's passed, why is there still an activation threshold? Chris?
Okay. So this is this is one of the important things, and I think this is where I head out on my thread most. Obviously there are two types of voting that take place on the XRP ledger. There is voting for fees, which is a separate process altogether from the voting in and of amendments. The voting of amendments follows the general principle of consensus, and that is the way in which we vote as validators. Now, there are a number of sites that explain this, but I'm going to give you my simplistic view of how this works. It's the way I understand it, and it's the way that I think it's not often well described. But with regard to the voting process, when a new amendment becomes enabled, I'll say that again. When a new amendment is amended to the XRP ledger, it sits there waiting to be enabled by way of a vote of the validators. Now, every single validator has the opportunity to vote, whether to enable it or to reject it. All those validators who accept it, all those validators who vote, all run a list on their validator called a UNL. Now that UNL determines, for want of a better word, a supermajority of people who make the final decision. But there's no guarantee as to who's going to be on that UNL or whatever. But I'm not going to go into that aspect just yet. But from a validator's point of view, I know that there are only a certain number of validators at this stage who have a say in what amendments get enabled and what get rejected. Now, when an amendment comes on and becomes amended to the XRPL, currently, it comes as a disabled function. And the reason for that is as Nik described about knowing the rules, if it becomes enabled instantly, anyone who's not running the version of software that amendment is enabled in will not understand the rules of the network and will be what's referred to as amendment blocked. So they won't know the rules and they won't be able to function as a validator on the main net. So insofar as the reason why I myself look at an amendment and how do I perceive that to be something that I'm going to vote to enable it or reject it, comes down to a number of things. First, I need to know that the amendment that's coming in is worthwhile for the network, that it's not going to have a burden on the network based on what it's trying to do, and that the number of validators that we've got are certainly up to speed to handle it, and from a network capacity, from a capacity of your server's ability to have that. I have a sip of coffee here. It's early in the morning and I've only recently got up, so I'm a bit cloudy, but I will come right. So I'll just go back a step. So the fundamental things for me are, A, that the network is sufficiently stable enough to include an amendment and to enable it. The second thing for me, and very important, is what the current community think about that amendment being enabled. So I listen to the community, I listen and talk to other validators, and we discuss what the importance is of that amendment coming in and being enabled, what functionality it is trying to achieve and whether it's going to achieve that. And also knowing full well that the people who are running validators, who depend on those validators to be, or nodes to be functioning, have had an opportunity to update before it becomes enabled. And we all know about the 2-week timer, but once a voting process takes place and it becomes activated, that timer becomes activated, there's a 2-week grace period whereby the vote has to be held at 80% or greater in order for that to then become enabled. Once enabled, that's it. There's no going back. So in short, it's looking at the number of validators who have updated to the version of software that the amendment came in, the purpose of the actual amendment, the impact it's going to have on the network by actually enabling it. And one of the other things is understanding the community. Now, a lot of validators have their own, each validator has their own choice. I myself listen to the community a lot regarding amendments and what they say and how they test and whether the functionality of it is as planned and as was intended. So yeah, that's, I suppose, from my point of view, the voting process and how I go about voting. But I'd prefer to answer the specific questions rather than describe them because, at this time of the morning I'm often a bit cloudy, but happy to answer questions and give my interpretation of those.
Yeah, I mean, you have been one of the first validators after Ripple that voted a yay on XLS20, right? And we had a couple of conversations about that because while I'm also keen on NFTs and get that stuff sorted, I waited with my vote for quite a while, and we had a couple of conversations about should I switch my vote or not. And my main concern was majority of the network running nodes. We don't know what they do because not every node is somehow linked to a known party. My main concern was what about we enable this, half of the network gets amendment blocked, and then someone in social media is freaking out about, oh, there's a major bug on the ledger and half the network is now blocked, because you know how crypto media works these days. But chiming in on what you said before, I have the same approach when it comes to the votes, which is making sure that's secure for the network. It doesn't pose a risk to operations because, as you said, there are entities on the ledger that have quote unquote real businesses running. So the ledger is fundamental to the business use case. So having half the network not working and exchanges not being able to process transactions would be a nightmare. So, and I'm just jumped in on that what you said because it's one of the comments that was actually planned for later. But I think a lot of people. Sorry,
for me, I actually have a set list that I work to when looking at amendments and whether or not I, as a validator, cast my vote. And that's having talked to the community and discussed it with the community extensively. But my list that I use is quite simply the purpose of the amendment, any benefit to the existing protocol that amendment can give, the implications of it being amended, and the testing behind it and any impact it is going to have on the network, the community interest, and that's an important one for me, the community interest, and then the impact of those validators or nodes who are going to be amendment blocked if this becomes enabled. Now, I can be very strategic. For me to put a vote of enable or accept to the ledger for this amendment is based on those criteria. However, it always comes with the rider that I can change that vote anytime within the 2-week period to a reject in order to maintain the resilience of the network and that we aren't looking at blocking too many people. So I have a threshold of roughly 70 to 75% of the network upgraded to the version of Ripple that has been amended. And once that threshold is there, then I'm comfortable to leave my vote as enabled, if that's the case, or if it has been always a rejected, that's the threshold. I will then change it to enable, should all the other criteria be met as well. With the XLS20, which is a classic example, this was an amendment that was introduced and had been talked about and promised for a very long time. And that the reason I gave an early vote of enable is I felt from a validator's point of view, it was important to show the community that I, as a validator, acknowledged the promises that were made and that there had been extensive testing taking place in the background by the introducers of the amendment, being Ripple, and that I was comfortable in putting my vote to enable to show my support to the community for that amendment to being introduced. And as I discussed with you, Daniel, that was one of the biggest reasons for it. But it always, and I stated this on Twitter, it always came with the rider that, should the need arise, I can momentarily revert that vote to reject. And as all amendments come with, currently all amendments come with a reject as the instant option to stop that issue of too many people getting blocked, amendment blocked. I think we as a group of validators all have our own criteria, and my criteria is to take into concern those people in the community who are relying on something, and there are a lot of them.
That was one of the reasons I changed my vote to a yay then as well, because I'm not happy with how many nodes running on 192 at the moment. But as you said, we can always, it's important to signal to the community that we want this amendment to go through. But I'm worried at the state of the network at the same time. But as you said, we can switch the vote back at any time if we have the feeling the network isn't ready. And it's kind of, there are various reasons why people don't update. It's not always clear. That's why it would be good if everyone who is a participant in the ecosystem just takes or joins conversations and discussions that are ongoing. GitHub would be a great place. That's what happened when Nik suggested the merger from the V1 and the fix into one amendment, because we had long arguments on Twitter about that, why some people voted on the fix but not on the V1 itself, which are now resolved. And I just had a quick look. We're now at 9 yays for XLS 20, and I'm confident that more nodes will be updating in the next weeks and more validators will vote yes on it. So because a lot of people always ask, when do we expect this to happen? This is always hard to know. It depends on when we're reaching majority. And one entity can't speak for another one. A lot of the current UNL operators are known, they're active, you can reach them on social media. And I get a couple of emails for this as well. I got like 5 emails last week about, oh, why is no one voting yay, and what's the process? I mean, I can't speak for anyone else, right? I can only speak for myself. So, but I think most operators voiced their concern or their reasoning behind their voting so far. Good. I think,
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, and that's exactly it. I think, we as validators, I particularly regard myself as a community validator, and that I like to think that I am representative of the community when I make my votes. And I think that's important in broadening our vision towards adding new validators and being being more inclusive in the decision-making process. And as long as the community are aware, the reason we bring in this functionality and the reason we bring in these resources and amendments, or anything we do on the XRP ledger, has nothing to do with the financial implications to somebody's investment for speculative purposes. It's all about the functionality and the ability to provide utility to those projects who need it and want to expand on what's already available. And so there's a lot of people out there who use the amendment process purely for their speculative gain, which is what it's not about. So I totally disregard the speculative side of things and only consider those who want the utility and build it. So one of my key questions has been, especially in XLS20, is to the community, and especially those who are relying on XLS20 to be enabled, is what have you done on the DevNet? What have you done on the testnet with regarding this? Have you got a fully functioning product on the testnet to show that A, it works, and B, you've given us the results of those tests, and you made it quite clear that everything that XLS20 has promised is actually doing and delivering, because it's that information that's going to make us as validators, and me especially, more likely to want to vote yes to enable than by sitting back in the dark and not knowing. So the way I say it is, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Tell us what it's like.
Sorry, did you just break up, or have you finished your sentence? Because for me, you were breaking up.
Oh, I beg your pardon. No, that's basically it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So I think we covered what an amendment is, how the voting process works. So let's move on with our questions. And the next one, which plays a bit into this as well, actually, is for Nik. Nik, could you speak a bit about the different types of RippleD servers that are, because not every server or every node on the network is a validator?
Sure. So first of all, I should clarify something. There is only one code base, RippleD for RippleD, right? So all the servers are running the same code. The only difference is that they can be configured to do or not do certain things. Let's first talk about validators, right? A validator doesn't do anything that a regular server doesn't do, right? In processing transactions, in executing them and verifying that the rules of the network are being followed. The only difference is that the validator takes that work that it does and signs it and publishes it to the rest of the network. So, my non-validator server does exactly the same work as my validator server does. It just doesn't publish it for the rest of the network to see. And so the difference is that a validator server actively contributes to the consensus process by performing the thing that validators uniquely do, which is to place transactions in a temporal order. In other words, to decide, given that we want to close a ledger, which transactions arrived in time to be included in the ledger that we're building versus the ones that should be punted to the next ledger. Now, servers can also be configured to operate in a couple of different modes. One is whether to hold full history or not. The XRP ledger doesn't need full history to function. Every ledger is a unique snapshot of the entire network, or of the entire state of the network, if you will, at that point of time, right? So your server can typically operate with just the current ledger. It doesn't need to know anything about the past. The past is usually only helpful to people that want to perform queries against the server, right? Like, what was my balance in 2017, right? Or this transaction that happened 7 years ago, show me details about it. So, but those are not typically questions that are particularly helpful, right? They're reasonable for some scenarios, but generally not for the operation of the server. So by default, servers don't hold full history. They hold a limited amount of history just for operational purposes, right? But they don't hold full history. You can configure your servers to operate in full history mode. And in that mode, they will try not only to keep up to date with the network, right? And that's always the server's first priority, to keep up to date with the network as it is right now, right? But they will also try to retrieve past historical state, right? What was the network like in 2018 or 2017 or 2016? All the way back to the effective Genesis ledger, 32,570. So in order to do that requires considerable resources, right? As you can imagine, the XRP ledger has a built-in DEX. Transactions are flying in and out all the time, right? To create new offers, to consume existing offers, change order books, and so forth. So storing all that takes a lot of space. I think that right now it's somewhere around 15 terabytes, 16 terabytes. Maybe Rabbit, who also operates several full history servers, can correct me. I haven't logged into my full history server for a while to see how much disk space is using. But servers can operate in full history mode. And lastly, there's also the configuration option to allow your server to service clients, right? Basically, that means it exports a WebSocket or an RPC interface that clients, whether that be wallets or applications or something else, connect to the server and ask it questions. Tell me what the current ledger is. What are the fees? Show me the balance of this account. Show me this order book. And that's a configurable option. You can, for some situations, it makes sense to enable it. For other situations, it makes sense to not have functionality available. So those are the general configuration options that you can do for RippleD. You can choose whether you're a validator. You can choose whether you want to have full history server or not, and you can choose whether to have client serving via WebSockets and RPC or not. Those questions, those answers are not necessarily exclusive of one another, but some configurations are generally not recommended, except for very specific use cases. Like, for example, it's usually not recommended that a validator be a full history server. It's possible to do, but it increases the overhead and the complexity of operating a validator. And typically a validator should be, as unburdened by other things as possible. And that's why, my own validator, for example, doesn't accept any connectivity from users as far as WebSocket, serving WebSocket or RPC requests, right? Its singular focus is on keeping up with the network and performing the tasks that validators perform. So that's kind of the categorization of the different types of Ripple D instances. And if anybody has any further follow-up questions, or would like me to dive into it a bit deeper, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, Rabbit just jumped back in. I think he wants to say something about the full history, the node of the full ledger. Can see he's unmuted, but I can't hear him. Well, he just left, so let's see if he comes back, or maybe he can put, just for reference, the full size in the channel, so we can read it out, so we got it on the record. Yeah, I jumped the topics a bit, but since we are on the tech stuff, let me have I got a few follow-up questions for you, Nik. So, how many validators are currently in the XRPL ecosystem?
So that can be a little tricky to understand. So for a couple of reasons, validations, validators broadcast their validation packets, but unless you're directly connected to a validator, you may or may not see their validations, right? Servers can choose whether they want to relay validations, and some servers opt to not relay validations by validators that they don't trust. So our kind of a best understanding, there's a number of servers, right, that are very commonly connected to, and so those typically tend to see validators directly. Those are the Zaphod cluster operated by Alloy Networks, Ripple's S1 and S2 servers. And our best tracking suggests that there's somewhere in the order of 100 to 120 validators. It fluctuates, up and down a little bit. It's not always easy to be sure if all of those are mainnet validators or they're kind of following their own chain, right? Maybe they're the altnet, right, or the testnet. So but our best estimate is somewhere between 100 and 120.
Just had a quick look on XRP scan.
Yeah,
as of the time, right now it's
XRP
yeah,
scan is just an
126.
amazing resource.
Yeah, there are 126 on mainnet as of time of the recording. But like you said, it's fluctuating a lot. Not all of them are on the latest version, so some of them are pretty outdated. To be honest, there's still one running on 1.73. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at that 173, and ironically enough, since you mentioned this, perpetually whenever we look at servers, right, like there appears to be one server that's running version 0.8 or 0.227, I don't remember. And it's completely baffling to me how that could possibly be, because that server shouldn't be able to, to even talk the basic connection protocol, right, to establish a connection. So I think somebody's running with a custom version number and trolling the rest of us. But yeah.
Yeah. Just to add this in, the current size of the full ledger is currently 22 terabyte. Scott's mic isn't working, so he apologizes. He just sent me a DM letting us know. Thanks for that, Scott.
Hey, just back. Can I just talk to the last question regarding the version? And I think it's important to know. I discussed this the other day, and Nik will probably be able to back this up. Even though some validators are running 1.7.3, they are not amendment block currently, because that was the last, from memory, that was the last amendment blocking Ripple update that took place. If that's, can you confirm that, Nik?
Yeah, I think that the last the last amendment that was activated was from 173, and that's the negative UNL code. And the amendments from 180, from the 18X series and from the 19X series haven't yet attained majority. So basically, any server running 173 or later versions is able to understand the network as it is today. But once any of these new amendments activates, like that, those servers won't be. They will become amendment blocked, and they will need to upgrade.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing. And when we talk about at what point do servers upgrade, and some of them, some servers may very well have a timeline. They may only update their server at a specific point in time, like once a month. Some will do it only when they become amendment blocked. Then they'll upgrade. And that's one of the things I think is important to understand is that whilst some are still running older versions of RippleD, they can still be fully functional as a validator on the network.
Yep, correct.
Great. So let's move on. That's one of the most burning questions when it comes to validators, at least on social media. Who can become a validator, and what makes the ideal validator? So another one for you, Nik. I mean, Chris, you can jump in as well. So
Yeah, so I don't think I have, mine is just one opinion out of many, right? And I think that different people have different criteria for what constitutes a good validator. Generally, from experience, my kind of criteria includes whether the operator of the validator is able to provide like high quality support, right, for that validator. If something crashes, like if that server, has a hardware failure at 4 a.m, right, on a Saturday, right, is somebody able to fix it, to address that expeditiously, right? Is that validator operator, is that server running at a facility, that's maybe local to where the operator is, or are they running in a cloud setup like AWS, or DigitalOcean, right? Is that operator do they have a vested interest in the ongoing success and health and continued operation of the XRP ledger, or are they just operating, just to learn something, right? Is this a toy validator, or is this actual production grade validator? So for me, those are the really kind of important characteristics. And I will point out that it's very easy to spin up a validator, right? What comes after, right, is kind of the more challenging part. Staying up to date, right? Ensuring that the system is secure, having good key management practices, making sure that you're not unintentionally centralizing the network, right? You can imagine a scenario where 7 or 8, different validator operators are all operating out of AWS. Like that's not a good situation, right? It creates an unintentional centralization on AWS, for example, or other cloud providers. So those are all factors. Those are all factors to consider. But basically, I think that what you really need to be a good validator operator is to be engaged and to want the XRP ledger to succeed, right? And to want it to remain healthy and decentralized, and to continue to evolve and operate, as fast as possible and as reliably as possible.
I can certainly vouch
Great.
for that.
Say it again, please.
I can certainly vouch for that. Just recently, I was remote, and I had a router fail, and so I had to get in my car, drive 300 kilometres, swap router, and drive back again 300 kilometres. And that's what being a good validator is about. Being expeditious in your repairs and remedies, and being able to meet those requirements to be a good validator. And that's, as Nik said, I concur with everything he says about being a good validator and the importance of understanding and being in knowledge of what to do should something go wrong. And often, we've had situations on the XRP ledger where we've had to not necessarily update our software, but make changes to our config with some urgency in order to facilitate an ongoing problem that's occurring on the network. And by doing that, we need to be in touch and be contactable. And they're the things that make a good validator.
Yeah, I can remember that, and I second that. You need some dedication, and you need to be have good response times when it comes to problems, just to make sure everything is running smooth. So just to add to the question, there are 2 links in the node operator channel under node chat, which explain that which explain how to set up a validator and how this works and how to be a good validator.
One other thing that I'd like to point out is part of what makes a good validator, and more generally, right, a good participant in the ecosystem is a willingness to learn. I think that out of everyone on the call, I've probably been operating Ripple instances for longer than anyone, right? And to this day, right, I learn a lot from other operators, from how they do things, from how they monitor their servers. And so I think a willingness to learn and a willingness to engage and improve is also a critical characteristic.
Yeah, it's every day something new is happening. You never stop learning. There are always people that can teach you a couple of tricks when it comes to that. So anyone who's interested can check 2 links. As Chris and Nik said before, it's not that hard. You need some basic knowledge about how to operate a Unix-based system. But I remember John Nielsen, who started with very little knowledge, his journey all the way up, got this all sorted and running, and is now a very proactive operator of a UNL node. So everyone can run a validator, and everyone can manage their way onto the UNL. So I just made a mistake during the call because I too quickly jumped to the tech stuff. So I want to go back to the amendment stuff again and have a quick deep dive on it. So Nik, how is the need for an amendment identified?
So as I said, what it boils down to, right, is you need to look at the change that you're introducing. If it modifies the way that a transaction will be processed between a server that has the code and a server that doesn't, then you need an amendment. So in discussing this, typically the people who contribute to the code base, the engineers, right, refer to these as transaction breaking changes. So a transaction breaking change can be something as simple as introducing a new field to a transaction, right? So for example, there's a pull request, right, to allow setting of validity times, right? The earliest time where a transaction is valid and the latest time when a transaction is valid in human terms. And so that's a transaction breaking change. It requires an amendment, right? Because it introduces new fields to a transaction, and servers that don't understand what those fields are, or how to process them, won't be able to process them the same way as servers that do understand them. So that's one characteristic. Another characteristic is the introduction of a new transaction type altogether, right? Like the NFT mint transaction, right? Servers don't understand that transaction if they don't have the NFT code, right? And so that's a transaction breaking change and requires an amendment. Similarly, the introduction of new ledger types, right? An NFT object on the ledger, right? That's a transaction breaking change. So those are typically the changes that require an amendment. Changes that change the way how a transaction will be processed between a server that has the code and a server that doesn't.
How exactly are amendments created?
So an amendment is basically just a number, right? You create this object on the ledger, right? There's this object on the ledger that lists all the amendments that are either currently active or currently being voted for. And so when you create this new amendment, you add a little bit of extra code into the code base that says to the server, here's a new amendment, right? And that the server associates that amendment with a large number, right? And so that number is the server then begins to vote once it's on and say, I support this new amendment, support this new amendment, right? And so servers look, other servers look and see, oh, Nik is voting for this amendment, and maybe they understand it, maybe they don't, right? But they see that I'm voting for a particular amendment. And the network reaches consensus eventually, right, on 80% of the servers support this amendment. And so they mark that particular amendment, identified by its number, as active, right? And so now servers can look and see what are the active amendments for this particular ledger, right? And so they look at that and decide what the rules of the network should be. So for the next ledger, the amendments might change. That's technically simplifying things a little. Amendments can only activate every 256 ledgers. So in between, they don't change. But that's the process by which an amendment is created. All you do is you define a little bit of extra code that tells to the server, here's an amendment, and this is what this amendment is called, right? And then you use that amendment internally in the code to conditionally execute code. If this amendment is active, do X, otherwise do Y, right?
Right. Thanks for that. Chris, can you tell us a bit about the difference between fixed amendment and feature amendments?
Oh, the difference. Well, the feature amendments are non-essential, obviously, and whereas a fix is exactly that. It's fixing something that is not functioning as intended in the code and needs to be remedied. And I think a couple of those with the recent amendments regarding the XLS20, where there were a couple of amendments needed to fix problems that were found once the original amendment had been amended to the code as Nik described. So yes, it's very simple. One's a feature that has been included, a new transaction system or a new transaction type, whereas the fix is fixing that. And Nik is probably a better person to actually explain that, but that's how I perceive it to be anyway, in simplistic terms.
Thanks. I think we touched this. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks for that. I think we touched this a bit before, but Nik, how exactly are amendments tested before they're being introduced to the main network?
So that's a good question. Typically, there's a whole different sets of testing, right? So typically, when my team and I introduce amendments or propose the introduction of new amendments to the code base, we include unit tests with that. And so a unit test is basically a synthetic code test, right? The server has special code internally. It kind of pretends to be running as a real server, but it's not. It's kind of more manually controlled, right? And we have very fine-grained control of the operation of this virtual environment. And so we can execute tests, without the amendment and with the amendment enabled, and we can try all sorts of corner cases. For example, with the NFT amendment, there's several tests that involve minting many NFTs, trying to split pages, right, and trying to combine pages as the number of NFTs that an account holds grow. They try to make transfers of NFTs from one account to another, with offers and brokered mode and direct mode and all of those things. So that's one level of testing. There's a further level of testing that happens by running the code on the DevNet, on the testnet, on different networks, right? And that's hopefully more publicly accessible. People can look at that, can look at those tests and run their own code, live code against them, right? Instead of operating in this kind of synthetic environment of the unit tests. We also very frequently perform significant performance testing. It depends on the type of amendment, but a good example again is the NFT amendment, right? Where we did a lot of performance testing to try and engage not only the performance of the code with NFTs, but also the sort of expected load and impact that this would have on the ledger and the operation of the main network, right? And so, those are the kind of tests that, my team and I perform. Others, do a lot of really, a lot of similar things. I think a good example of this is the Hooks Amendment, right? Introduced, or that's proposed by Richard Holland and XRPL Labs. And they've had a test network of their own, right? Where they're testing this code and it's public for people to try and write hooks and exercise it and break it. Right, and so they're testing. They're doing some very similar testing. But those are very broadly the types of tests that we do. I think it's important to point out, and this is something I always do, right? It's important to point out that we really have to get it right when we do updates to the code base and deploy them to the main network, because this is not a network that should break. Right, we need to be extremely, extremely careful. There's a very high bar in including code and making changes. Right, the code, the guts of the code are structured in such a way that the network always prefers to be safe. Right, and so if something weird happens, we have things like the invariant checking engine, right, which will prevent like certain types of mistakes, from actually executing. We have a lot of protection servers that find themselves in a weird state, will try to respond potentially by shutting down, right? But it's definitely the sort of environment where we all need to be really careful. And by all of us, I mean not just developers, right, but server operators too, right? If a release comes out today, right, you shouldn't really update maybe right away. Take a minute, right, and see if other people are upgrading and having issues. Like not every, we don't need to rush to update everything in real time, right? So I think that those are all important things to do, and part of the testing strategy that we should be having, as an ecosystem, right? And my coworker Manoj, who's leading our testing and QA team internally at Ripple, also reminded me that we have a very large end-to-end suite of tests that we run. And so by end-to-end, I mean we actually spin up a network, right, with actual servers running, and we bombard it with transactions. We might load, say, a particular ledger from the main network. We might load ledger 57 million, right, and then execute like 2 million transactions, and see that the network behaves as expected, that nothing breaks. So there is a lot of testing happening, but I want to be very clear that this sort of testing isn't only the realm of programmers, developers, and QA teams. It's on every server operator. You should also be looking and saying, hey, a new release is out. Let me first test it and see. Let me install it and run the unit tests on it and make sure that they succeed. Right. Let me check and see. Put a server on the testnet or the devnet, right, and test against it. Make sure that it's stable for my particular configuration and scenarios, right? And so I think that's another thing that I would.
Are all results of unit tests being published, or was the one for XLS 20 that was different?
So unit tests are inside the code and anyone can run them. I think there's actually a PR to disable to make unit tests not always included in the code, right? But in my opinion, it's fine to include them. So Ripple typically doesn't always publish our results for testing, but that might be something that we'd be interested in doing, especially for amendments, right? That introduce new functionality, and I think that's probably a good call out. Some of our tests are not open, right? The sort of tests that orchestrate the spin up of a network and executing of millions of transactions require like a lot of infrastructure and a lot of glue, that puts all these systems together and runs these tests. And so I think that's not necessarily something that's easy for others to replicate and do. And I don't know to what extent that code is ready to be made, public. So, it might be a little bit pieced together with, duct tape and string. So, but I do think that that's something that we should collectively, right, look to do. Have serious performance tests on the testnet and the devnet and the altnet, right? And that might be something that the foundation can help facilitate, right? But that might also be something that Ripple or other participants in the ecosystem can facilitate. So I think that's an interesting question to further explore.
While we in this area, how is code usually being audited and reviewed?
So the up until very recently, the repository for the code base was under the Ripple organization on GitHub. It has since transitioned to the XRP Ledger Foundation, which is great. And the process that Ripple had been following is to have at least 2 engineers review the code before it gets merged, and make sure that things like unit tests and performance tests and and such pass, right? But I do think that process is going to have to change a little bit, as the repo is now under the foundation, and there are other engineers other than Ripple engineers who are contributors to the repo and active maintainers. And so I think that process is in the process of changing, right? So it's a little bit in flux. I think it will only get better, right? It will get more thorough, deeper, more extensive, which is exactly what you want, right? You want code to be very, very well vetted. But basically the general review process and the auditing process, if you will, is that somebody opens a pull request. Anyone is free to review that code and leave comments. And some of those comments, might be blockers, right? They need to be addressed, and some of those might be advisory. Hey, I think you should do X versus Y, right? And then the maintainers basically take a look and say, yeah, we feel that this PR is ready for it to be merged or not. One other thing on the topic of auditing, Ripple has currently engaged an auditing firm to do a code review of the code base. That will be made public. It's in the process. Of being, the code base is in the process of being audited and reviewed, and so that will be something that I think is a big bonus, right? A good thing to have a team of really skilled professional, people who focus on auditing code to go through the code base and look at it very carefully and try to think of, hey, where can this be improved? And I think that's something we will probably continue to sponsor going forward in the years going forward, kind of as a service to the broader XRP Ledger community.
Sounds good. The last question for this deep dive on amendments is for Chris. Chris, could you explain us what default amendment votes are and how default values are decided?
Yeah, so ultimately, as an amendment is amended to the protocol, a default vote comes with that. Now, in the past, it used to be a yes vote, and we used to have to actively put in a reject vote to stop the timer activating and the simple risk reduction of people being amendment blocked or validators becoming amendment blocked. So currently the situation is that for feature type amendments, they come with a default reject vote within the code, and that on that basis, a validator then has to decide, go through his due diligence as to what or how they decide to enable that amendment and to vote for it. And we've talked about that before, about how we go about that process. But in simple terms, the default is for a feature that is unessential is to come in with a reject. But any feature that is a fix for an urgent problem, that for the norm would come in with a accept vote as the default, in order to get that passed quickly and in and operating. But also mindful that any amendment that becomes enabled will have an impact on the network, especially for those who are not running that version of Ripple D that amendment arrived in.
Sorry, did you break up or?
No, that's fundamentally it. Unless Nik wants to add anything to it, it's either for a feature that's not essential right now, then it would come with a reject as the default vote. If it's a fix that needed some urgency to it, it would come with a enable fix to it. An enable so that it gets passed quickly. But we are mindful of the effect that would have on the network anyway.
Okay, thanks for that. So in terms of validator question and amendment questions, we're done with the list that I had been given. So we got a couple of community questions. Just again, sorry for jumping between the amendments and the validators before, because I didn't sort my questions correct. So that's on me. Hopefully this can be fixed in the published recording. So we got a couple of community questions. I'll just read them in the order. So we might be jumping back and forth a bit as well. They're open to both of you. So let me start with the first one. What's the monitoring process to make sure your validator is running at 100% uptime? What about if you are away from your validator and your power internet goes down? That's actually a really good one, because you had an anecdote about this before, Chris.
Oh yeah, so monitoring, I do that through a number of different ways, and run numerous bits of software to monitor and advise me when things go down. But then when your main functionality of the internet goes down, and then you've lost something. Either you've lost your internet connection or you've lost the router. And as I explained before, I lost my router. I was 300 kilometers away from where my router was, and there's no other way to fix that other than getting somebody to go and do it for you, or you do it yourself. So I jumped in the car 300 kilometers later. I swapped my one router to another, and 30 seconds later we were back up and running, and I drove another 300 kilometers back where it was. So it's about being able to know when your router, when your service goes down, and there are a number of facilities that we can monitor it. I run some software, like I say, that tells me that. Others just use some information like XRP scan, for example. That'll tell you when you've gone down, whether you've hit a negative UNL. That's for me. Nik would have his own way of doing things, I'm sure.
So I think we need to. By the way, great question and great answer, Chris, as well. So I think we need to distinguish between two different things. First of all, is your server actually operating, and so that kind of becomes a question about how do you monitor your server, right, to make sure that it's running and the process is running and so forth, versus your server performing well in staying connected and synced to the network, right? And that's the sort of metric that you see on XRP scan, right, where it says 99% or 100%. So I want to be very clear that 100% on XRP scan doesn't necessarily or anything less than 100% doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad validator. It's perfectly normal for a validator to miss one or two validations. Networks flap, routes flap, connectivity, has jitters and so forth. And so, I don't think that you need to necessarily have 100%, validation success rate against the network, right? Obviously, if you're at like 80% or 90%, then maybe there's there's something to look at there in terms of reliability and or other questions to answer. But 100% isn't needed there. Now, on the flip side, you want your server to be highly reliable, right? You want to be on a network that's stable, that has plenty of bandwidth, right? A lot of people that are operating high-end, kind of validators will have standby, hot standby machines, right? That they can transfer their validator to if the primary machine fails, right? Having the sort of these sort of processes and exercising that muscle, right, is important. Good management practices for the server, right? Make sure that you have things like kernel care, or if you're running on Linux, making sure that you're up to date patches and so forth is also important. And then you can use the typical tools that administrators and server operators use, right, to monitor their servers. Some people like to use Grafana. Other people like to use our MRTG or RRD tool, right? Those are all tools that you can use to monitor your server in different ways. I don't think there is a particular answer. You can ask 20 server administrators, 20 server operators how they monitor their hardware, how they monitor their servers, and you'll probably get 20 different answers. So I think that as long as you have a process, right, that allows you to check on your server, make sure that it's running, that you get notified if your server is down for more than a few minutes, right? Like if it's unreachable for more than a few minutes, and that you have a plan in place for what you do, and that you exercise that you test it and make sure that it works, right? Then that's really what you should be doing as a responsible server operator. I operate a number of servers, myself, and most of my servers I'm able to reach remotely through a secure process, right? But one time I happened to be away, a server went bad, and once it was the one server that I just had configured remote access to, and so it had to stay shut down for like a few days until I managed to get back, right? And so that kind of shows that it's failures will happen, and they'll happen when you least expect them. And so it's important to be sure that you have both the experience or both the measures in place and the experience using them to make sure that you're able to respond to that error, especially if you're a validator, especially if you're listed on the UNL of an entity like the foundation or Coil or Ripple, right? That people broadly use. So that would be my answer there.
Yeah, so it's usually best practices when it comes to operating a system, something that is monitoring your system, gives you a notification, and a plan if something goes wrong. And
I think too, sorry, Daniel, I think too that
no problem.
RippleD itself doesn't really have very good monitoring interfaces, right? That allow it to be monitored by standard tools. That's something that we should improve, right? Collectively, that's something that we should try to make better, so that it's easier for people to plug RippleD directly into their existing monitoring infrastructure, or to use standard monitoring tools, as opposed to having to develop something custom. And so, if you have experience, right, monitoring servers, if you are a server administrator in your real life, or if you administer servers and have a setup and a system that already works, right, and you figure out a way to connect RippleD to it, well, maybe do a write-up, or if it's some kind of recipe, right, that somebody could import into the same monitoring system, make it public, put it on GitHub, and say, here's my recipe for monitoring my RippleD instance, right? Make that public so that other people can take what you wrote and use it, who may not be as versed or as skilled as you in low-level system administration, right? And so in doing that, I think you help strengthen the network by strengthening the individual nodes that are part of the network.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. All right, let's move on to the next question, which is, who can author a proposal for an amendment vote? How might someone how might someone go about proposing an amendment?
So the answer is anyone. So, and I mean this in two different ways. So first of all, anyone can create a pull request and make a proposal, right? To include a change into the code base, and that change can include and introduce an amendment. So anyone can do that, right? And people can then, once they, if that change is merged and a release is made, then people have that code and can choose to vote that amendment up or down, right? So in that sense, anyone can do it. Obviously, just because you can create an amendment doesn't mean you should, right? And it doesn't mean that just because you made the change, it will be approved and merged and much less adopted, right? But in principle, anyone can do it. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind what amendments are for, right? And why we need them, and also to keep in mind that an amendment by definition, unless it's a fixed amendment, right? But a feature amendment, almost by definition, introduces some additional work, some additional load, right? And I don't necessarily mean load in terms of, CPU usage or memory or whatever, right? But I mean it in the sense that every server operator will have to carry that code. And if the amendment is activated, it becomes extremely difficult to actually ever remove it. So the cost of that amendment, in code and in ledger objects and in memory and in resources and in almost every way, is a cost that has to be borne by every node on the network in perpetuity for as long as the ledger will exist. And so I think it's really important that we think, is an amendment needed? Is a particular new feature needed? My general philosophy is that the ledger doesn't need to be all things to all people, right? It doesn't need to do everything else. It doesn't need to do just because some other chain does something doesn't mean we have to. We have a kind of our unique identity and kind of our unique philosophy about things, right? And we should try to keep that. Of course, if the general direction is that we want to change that philosophy, that's perfectly fine too. But it's not a philosophy that we should just abandon without really carefully considering what that means. And so I think that while anyone can propose an amendment, and I can imagine like 1,000 different possibilities for amendments, I think that the question is that we should be asking is, are those use cases important enough to justify the cost that we will all have to pay in introducing them, adopting them, and then long term maintaining that amendment?
Great answer. So I like the next question, and it's a conversation I had with Chris a couple of times by now. How does one validator trust another validator, and what's the importance of validators trusting each other?
The elephant in the room question. So yeah, this is a really complex topic, and it's one that I struggled with for a long time, and one that I struggled to get in my head and get my head around. And we've had numerous discussions recently about this. As we know, consensus involves the process of my validator talking and reaching consensus with all those validators on my trusted node list, or my UNL. Now, the protocol itself only visits my UNL, it visits your UNL, it visits Nik's UNL, and it determines the consensus process by visiting those UNLs. Now, I myself could opt in to create my own list. But for me to create my own list, I would have to find out the owner of every validator, what their intentions are on the network, how reliable they are, about all the things we discussed before about monitoring and uptime and performance and, what redundancy they have. I would have to research every single one of those people to have them added to my list, my UNL list. And they would be determined as the validators that I trust. If there was poor performance, I would have to remove them. Or if they fell below a threshold that I'm willing to accept, I would then remove them and then hopefully replace them with someone else that I've learned to trust. There is the other alternative whereby I can go and use a list that is created by somebody else and published. That published list, I know that the people who have made that list up have done all the due diligence on the validators who are on that list to determine that they are trusted by them. As I was a member of one of those trusted lists, I knew the procedure that list publisher went to determine whether I was reliable and worthy of being on their trusted list. Now, so the important thing is, and this was a question that was asked the other day, if there is a validator on that trusted list that I am using that is not performing, why do I not remove them? And my answer to that is simple. I go to the publisher of the list that I use and I say to them, you are publishing a list with a validator that's not performing. Why are you allowing that to happen? And what are we going to do about either fixing the problem or removing them? Because what I've done is I'm satisfied in my decision to use a published list of validators to trust on my validator. So therefore, if there is ever a problem, I go to the publisher of the list. I don't go to the validator concerned. I go to the person who's made up that list and say, fix it. If you're not going to fix it, well, then I can no longer trust you as a publisher of that list to be a trustworthy publisher. So I remove that publisher from my UNL. So what it really comes down to for me is that the protocol requires a UNL list. I choose to use a list provided by somebody else on my validator, and I rely on that publisher to keep up to date with that list that is provided. The protocol does not concern itself with how you get to or derive your list or whose list you use. It merely looks at your validator at what list you are actually using. Who are the validators on your list? It doesn't concern itself with how it got there, who published the list, and what the intent is with that list. So I think that sums it up for me. Whilst my validator forms part of a group of validators who make a lot of decisions on the network, the reason I am there is because every validator that I know of opts in to use a published list that has me on it. I could be removed from that published list tomorrow and I would be gone as one of those validators that is making decisions around consensus. Although all validators have a say in consensus, I'm one of the super majority of validators, and that number of validators can be 30, it could be 35, it could be 50. It really depends on what each validator has on their UNL. There's my answer.
So let me just add a couple of things here. So first of all, I think it's important to understand what exactly it means to trust a validator, right? To have a validator on your UNL. As I mentioned earlier, the only thing that validators really do is to function as clocks and put transactions in order, right? In other words, given a set of transactions, right? In a point in time, a validator's job is to say which subset of those transactions came before the time point and which came after. So, the function that validators uniquely perform is that, right? And that's kind of the input to the consensus process. You look at what validators, you look at what different validators think in terms of time, and collectively the network in a well-defined process reaches consensus, right, on what the set of transactions that we all kind of agree on, right, it should be included in the next ledger. Now, the other thing is, by what criteria do you include validators in your set of trusted validators, right? And each server can have its own list of trusted validators. And basically the criteria is that you trust those validators to not collude with each other to defraud you, right? And you don't trust them to do the right thing, right? Because you independently apply the rules of the network and examine each transaction that is proposed and apply the transaction based on the rules of the network as you understand them. And so a validator can't trick you into executing a transaction that's invalid, right? So that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, with that said, the protocol's design, right, is such that there needs to be a certain amount of overlap between the validators that you trust and the validators that I trust, if we both want to be, on the same network or on the same chain, if you will, right? If you and I only have like 2% overlap between our validators, then almost certainly we will be in different networks, in different forks, in different chains. Right? So the amount of divergence that one can have, right, between before you kind of increase your risk of being in a different chain varies depending on the security guarantees that you need. Under some models, right? Which is the sort of academic inquiry into consensus, right, that you would see in a paper like the Brad Chase and Ethan McGraw paper, can be as high as high 90s, like 94% or 96%. I don't remember exactly. That's not necessarily the amount of overlap that you need in order to be safe in practical, real world scenarios, but it also informs, right, your decision as node operators about whether to have your own list, right, that you maintain, or whether to use a list that's published by an entity that you consider to be responsible, whether that's Ripple or the XRP Ledger Foundation or Coil or two of them or three of them or somebody else entirely, right? And of course, you also need to kind of look and see what other participants in the ecosystem that you want to remain on the same chain with are doing as well. I'll just use an example. If our friends at GateHub, right, decide that all of a sudden that they'll publish an entirely different list, right, that includes, none of the validators that say Ripple recommends, right? Well, if staying in the same chain with GateHub is important to you, then maybe you need to consider migrating to a list that's closer to the one that GateHub has, for example. And so I think that those are all parameters that you need to be thinking about as server operators. Generally, this isn't an issue because the people that are publishing lists are responsible stewards of the ledger, right? And they try to do the right thing conceptually, right? In terms of not changing the list too fast, right? Don't go from 35 validators to 30 in a day, right? In one ledger, right? Don't drastically change the UNL. Don't drastically diverge from other UNLs that might be in common use, and try to work to either ensure that the different lists maintain sufficient overlap, or to have a particular list deprecated, right? So that fewer and fewer people use it, right? And so it becomes increasingly, increasingly less relevant to kind of the day-to-day operations of the network. So those are all things that responsible operators need to be thinking about. My general recommendation, and only speaking for myself, I'm not speaking on behalf of Ripple. This isn't a dictum, though, and so I'm not speaking ex cathedra. But my general recommendation is to trust the XRP Ledger Foundation. That's what I do on my own servers, right? I think that the process that they have for creating lists makes a lot of sense. I also listen to the list that Ripple publishes. So my servers both listen to those two lists. In the past, I used to listen to the COIL list as well. I changed it because I was running a test and I commented their list out to test something, and I haven't enabled them back since. But my preference is to, instead of having my own curated list of validators, to use the list published by COIL, by Ripple, and by the XRP Ledger Foundation. And because I know the people behind those lists and the process that they follow in putting it together, and the sort of due diligence they perform, which is important, as I mentioned earlier, for several reasons, right? From knowing the operators to centralization concerns that might be hidden, right? Because 2 or 3 servers might be on the same, cloud provider or whatnot. And so my general recommendation to people would be to use lists as opposed to manually picking and choosing individual validators.
Great addition. Let's move on to the next question. It's XLS21. If XLS20 NFTs don't use trust lines, why would an issuer be able to opt to automatically have trust lines created, as an example, for transfer fees to be paid in IOUs?
Well, so to be able to have transfer fees paid as IOUs is one reason, right? But also, in order to be able to have somebody to be able to offer you an asset, right? To make an offer to buy an NFT from you for an asset that you don't have a trust line, right? And so in you accepting that offer, that automatically creates the trust line as well. So.
Great. Another one in regards to NFTs. Is it possible for someone to front-run NFT brokers by making offers directly to sellers based on their knowledge of the broker's orders book? As an example, maybe talk to someone about why a person would use a broker.
So, yes and no. In theory, right, brokered mode, at least the way I thought about it, was to facilitate marketplaces, right? And the intention was to make it so that a marketplace, that you as an NFT, as a holder of NFTs, could use a marketplace without transferring your NFT to the marketplace, because I wanted to avoid the possibility of, custodial marketplaces where the marketplace itself is hacked and your NFTs are stolen. And so the idea was to allow, or in some situations where you have a particular firm, right, that issues some NFTs, but they issue it through a well-known marketplace, right? But they don't want that marketplace to have access to their account, right? And so the spec includes 2 features for that. It includes the authorized minter, right? And it includes the ability to have what's called brokered mode. So in brokered mode, somebody can place an offer to simultaneously buy and sell an NFT, right? And so typically you can't really front run transactions, brokered or direct mode NFT offers, because NFT offers are never automatically accepted. You make an offer and then somebody has to accept that offer. So if you're using a brokered mode, right, it might be that you have an agreement with that person that, hey, I'll sell you this NFT for X, and whatever else you can sell it for, like if you can sell it for higher, you get to keep the extra amount, right? And so that's the scenario with brokered mode. Could somebody conceivably look at the brokered mode and place a better offer? Yes, right? That's certainly it could be done. And then the person that's looking to accept the offer, could look and make a decision. Do I want to accept the brokered mode, or the better offer, right? But because it's not an automatic thing, right? Again, I wouldn't really use the term front running. Can somebody outbid you, right? And by outbid, I mean make a more attractive offer. Yes, they can, but I don't think that's necessarily like if you look at NFT marketplaces, that's typically what ends up happening, anyways, right? People will place an offer to buy an NFT for X, and then somebody will come in and buy it for X plus something, and then somebody else will come in and buy it for a little more than that, until one person's offers sufficiently large that nobody wants to offer anymore, at which point that offer is probably accepted at some point.
Sense. I hope this answers the question. I haven't seen any follow-ups on Discord, so let's just move on to the next one. Can you give specific examples of changes to the Ripple code base that did not need amendments?
Yeah, sure. So there's a number. Like if you look at the commit logs, right, and you see the changes that have been made, most of the changes don't require amendments. For example, the other day, like I made a large change to the way that the job queue, which is a data structure that we use as a priority queue to allow handling of the different tasks that Ripple has to do in the background, right? I made a large change in how that thing operates. That doesn't require an amendment. My coworker Scott Detterman made a change a while ago to change how internally we track these things called SHAMAP items or SHAMAP nodes, right? And that saved significant amount of memory. It did not require an amendment change, right? Because there were changes that don't impact the way transactions are processed. They change the logic by which the server operates, but regardless of which version of the code you were running, any transaction that you would execute would give you identical results with or without that change. So I don't have like specific changes in mind right this instant, other than the ones I mentioned. But I think that if you look at the commit log, you will see that the vast majority of changes that are made to the code base do not require any amendments. Actually, a good example might be early sidechain work, right? Some of the sidechain work, the early days, did not require an amendment at all, right? All it did is it used these door accounts, and so the process didn't really make any changes, right? It used mostly native functionality, and so it didn't require any changes. Things may have changed in the meantime, right? And so it might end up that sidechain, requires amendments, but at least conceptually, sidechains don't require an amendment.
So it's safe to say if something doesn't touch underlying fundamentals, it's probably not becoming an amendment.
Well, it depends on what you mean by fundamental. I think, but if you mean by fundamental in terms of the protocol details itself, right, like the transactions, right, or the structures or fields and the like, then if they don't have any change transactions, then it's almost certainly not a protocol breaking change. But if they have any sort of changes to transactions or to the rules by which transactions are processed, then it's a transaction breaking change.
Yeah,
I think the general there's if you look at the code, there's under source there's the source Ripple app TX folder. So basically if you make any changes, and this is very very broad, right? It doesn't cover 100%, but basically any change you make to any significant change you make under that folder will almost certainly implicate an amendment. But again, it's kind of hard to be 100% sure without looking at some specific code.
Yeah, got it. Okay, next question. What would the process be for XLS31D, that's the automated maker, to actually become an amendment? Would it require massive changes to the code?
Yes, it will require significant changes to the code to introduce all the new transactors that XLS31D discusses, right? And the on-ledger structures that XLS31D discusses. And so the process will likely be that the team within Ripple, that's working on the automated market maker, right, will continue coding up the specification, right? We will engage with any feedback that the community has to refine that spec and make any changes that collectively we feel need to be made, right, to address concerns or issues or bugs that are discovered. And then when we feel that the code is in a good enough state, our team will make a pull request to the repo, officially proposing it for inclusion into the code base and introducing the amendment. Now, that at that point, you go through code review, right? And the different people can participate in that code review and look at the code and examine it and check and make sure that it's all good. And at that point, hopefully that code gets merged, right? And so that would introduce a new amendment, and then it would be up to the operators, servers, validator operators, to choose whether to vote in support of the automated market maker amendment or not, right? And at which point, once the amendment hopefully gains majority, right, and retains that majority for 2 weeks, then the amendment becomes active, and that code effectively begins operating. If it never reaches a majority, and if it never activates, then that code is effectively dead code anyways, and maybe it will be removed at some point, or maybe. Right? So that's the process for any amendment, really, right? Any proposal to change the XRP ledger, and certainly for XLS31.
Okay, hold on. I just got a comment that something was messed up, because apparently there was a different amendment that was then changed to 31 and then back to 30, and now we have two amendments 31. The question was directed at was transaction type specific signer quorum values for multi-sig signing. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Okay. So I'm not aware of it. The unfortunate that there's another conflict. I know there was a conflict with XLS30, right? And I think that we renamed our XLS30 to XLS31. Unfortunate that there's now a conflict with XLS31. I'm not familiar with the amendment or with the proposal that you described, right? Quorum specific or transaction specific quorum values for multi-signing, but I don't think that just from the title, right? I think I kind of understand what's being proposed, and I think that my comments, my earlier comments, still apply, right? The process will largely be the same. There will be some discussion about the proposal. People will make comments. Hey, I like this, or I don't like this, or I think this should be changed, or I think this needs to be enhanced, or whatnot, right? And at some point, the proposal itself will settle, right? People will feel comfortable with where the proposal is, right? And at that point, right? I don't know who the proposer of this amendment is, and if they're willing to code it up or they're just proposing it. Hopefully somebody will implement that code change and submit it as a pull request, right, for people to review. Hopefully review passes, and any issues are addressed. Review passes, the code gets merged, and then it's up for voting. So the process will be very much the same. In that sense, there's no difference. There's no real difference in the process whether Ripple is proposing something or someone else is proposing something. It's really the same thing. I think that the only difference is that the team within Ripple, certainly, we have more people than than most other external teams, and we kind of have maybe perhaps more experience in making some of these changes. But there wouldn't be any difference in the actual process as far as the integration of the code and the adoption of it and the amendment voting would be concerned.
Okay, thanks for clearing it up. We've got 3 more questions to go. I think that one's pretty easy. How does an amendment get distributed to the network? Does it come as a patch or through the package managers? Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear your question. Can you repeat that?
Okay, let me read it again. How does an amendment get distributed to the network? Does it come as a patch or through the package manager?
Well,
It's mainly
so
about how code's getting shipped.
yeah, so typically, and again, as I said, that Ripple has been following a particular process for a while now, but now that the repo is under the foundation's control, things will probably change a little bit again for the better, right? But generally, the process is that code, the code that's proposed for inclusion will get proposed and included into some some release, right? And making releases that are kind of beta releases, right? And releases that are more well vetted, right? And so if you want to be running beta code, you can, and if you want to be running stable code, you can. But the process is that once a change is proposed, right? A PR is open to make some change. That change gets adopted and merged into the code base. Eventually, that code change gets released, and people can either grab packages that are built by say either the foundation or Ripple, right? Depending on who you're pulling your packages from, right? Or you can maybe download the code yourself and compile the code yourself. I rarely use packages on my own machines. I just compile myself. But obviously that requires, having an environment set up to do that and all of the dependencies and so forth. And so that might not be tenable for a number of server operators. And so typically they would use packages, and they would get those changes through packages, right, when they are released.
Okay, great. What happens if a major bug impacts the network? Can validator operators be forced to update immediately?
So validator operators and any server operator, right, they can't really be forced to do anything, right? There's no truncheon large enough to that anyone can yield to actually force a group of basically random people like to do something. I do think, however, the operators that we have on the XRP ledger, by and large, are responsible participants who are interested in maintaining the health of the ledger and making sure that the ecosystem is working well, right, and thriving. And so I think that if a large bug were to be discovered that necessitated kind of an urgent update, right, I think that most operators would understand and would react swiftly to try and do that. Certainly the case. Certainly in the past, it's been the case if we had to issue like a hotfix release to fix kind of a breaking bug or something that was maybe a little bit more elevated in severity. People, especially validator operators, have been very quick to respond and review the changes and kind of update very quickly. So I think that I would expect to see that pattern kind of continue again, because in my experience, most of the operators are not only very engaged, but they're very passionate about the long-term health and success of the XRP ledger.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead.
I'm just saying, yeah, absolutely. There is nothing as a validator that we are forced to do. Every action or reaction we make to our validator, to our server, is entirely of our own doing and of our own choice. And I think it's an important part. And it's important then when there is a bug, we find out about that bug very quickly, because things just don't work as they should with regard to our monitoring, and then we get together and we discuss and talk and look for remedies and find solutions, and then people go to work and make those solutions happen, very quickly. And Nik is incredibly quick at sorting these bugs out, and as are others as well. We sometimes need to make config changes rather than changes to the code in the short term to remedy things. And that's where it's important that the validators are able to do that and what have you. Everything is entirely optional on each validator owner as to when they do it, how they do it, and on what instruction they do it.
I think I'd like to also point out one other thing. There is a standard, kind of a, you're not required to follow it, but it allows it's for publishing what's called a TOML file, which contains information about your server. Allows you to bind your validator to a particular domain so that it shows as associated with your domain, as opposed to just showing that it's public key, which is the random string of numbers. The TOML file also allows you to put contact information in, and I think that's important because having contact information, right? Like my go-to example is there used to be a validator. I don't know if it's still out there, called XRP Goat. Now, I don't know who's behind XRP Goat, right? But if something is happening on the network that requires kind of to get the attention of people and say, hey, like you need to update, or hey, this is happening, here's kind of what to expect. I think that having contact information is important. And so if you operate a validator, or if you operate infrastructure and you don't have a TOML file, please consider adding a TOML file. If you don't, if you have a TOML file but don't have contact information, please consider adding contact information. There is some thought about allowing encrypted contact information so that your information, perhaps like an email or something, is not necessarily broadly publicly accessible, but might be encoded with a BGP key that allows people that you might trust, to actually view that information. So there's certainly enhancements that could be made there in terms of privacy, but please consider including contact information in your TOML file, so that in case that something is wrong, right, it's possible to reach out to people. And also try to participate in channels, right, like whether it's the Discord or the Mattermost, right, where other people congregate, so that you can be quickly stay up to date in a kind of a real-time format if the need arises.
Yeah, I mean, based on how this was conducted in the past, we know this works pretty good. But as Nik just said, it's very important that we have some sort of real-time communication channel in case something goes wrong. Okay, last question for today. Is there a standard way to build an extension to RippleD, as an example, translate to or from ISO 222 transactions?
That's a little bit of a confusing question to me. So as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I understand, rather, ISO 2022, whatever it is, I don't know exactly the ISO spec, is just a messaging protocol, right? It just defines a language, right, or a set of fields and values, right, that allow for allows messages to be exchanged in an interoperable way. RippleD doesn't speak ISO 2022. RippleD doesn't understand, such messages. And so if somebody wanted to write some kind of gateway or bridge that allows, that allows the submission of a transaction to the XRP ledger in ISO 2022 format or whatnot, that's certainly possible, but there's no direct correlation between ISO 2022 and the XRP ledger. I know that that's a very popular topic on Twitter, and people are, very excited. They're like, "Oh, ISO this and ISO that." I don't think there's any particular relevance to the XRP ledger, however.
Yeah, I don't have any other context to the question, so I can't shed any light on it. Nothing came up on Discord, so excuse me. So yeah, from my point of view, as far as I can see, the number of the questions, we're almost like 2 hours going on for now. I'd say we come to an end for today. If people still have questions, we can continue the discussion on Discord, or if something wasn't entirely clear, we can maybe include something in the next call. If you guys don't want to say anything else or don't have anything to add, I would give you a last chance to say goodbye to everyone, and I would close it up then.
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate everyone joining. These calls are fun. It's awesome to kind of have the real time format to be able to discuss these things. I appreciate everyone joining, and I hope to see you to see you all and more people in the next one.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for joining in, and thanks for the opportunity. Scratchy start without coffee, but we got there in the end.
I'm glad you made it. So I know it's not easy for you to get up that early. Just joking. Yeah, guys, Chris, Nik, thanks for being here with us. Thanks for answering all the questions. I hope we could clear some confusion about amendments and the voting process up. Other than that, just would like to remind everyone, if you want to submit a proposal for Apex, please post it. Check the link that Rabbit posted in the Apex channel here in Discord. If you have any questions in regards to that, you can reach out to him directly on Discord or Twitter via DM. Other than that, I would wish you all a great day, good morning, good night, wherever you are, and see you guys next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.